You see, that's the UK edition. So the American one is a slightly different looking cover, but those great covers. It's called A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks. And as I say in the prologue to this book, it's not the history of the world. It's a history of the world. And in that sense, it's really fairly autobiographical because a good half of the wrecks in it, six of the chapters, are sites that I've dived on or been involved in or been in charge of excavating myself. When I started to think of the book and how I could construct this history of the world focusing on wrecks, I didn't really necessarily think of it that way. I thought that I might be choosing other sites which might have been more representative of particular periods. But as I was writing it, I realized that I did have this great strength in that I myself have investigated these wrecks, which range in date from antiquity to the 19th century, 20th century, and that the way to write really good archaeology and really good history is if you can actually bring in your own personal adventure, if you like, in researching and discovering this material. And I could do that in abundance for this book. And so as I was writing it, it did develop this stronger association with my own discoveries. And I think, well, certainly from what the reviews have been saying, that's worked very well. It's been a good strength. I mean, for example, in the chapters where I'm dealing with wrecks that I've dived on, I begin them with a very personal account of what it's like actually to get in the water and dive down. Just the question you were asking at the beginning, what is it like? And I can remember talking to my editor about this, and they were saying, that's exactly what will hook readers on this material. And I found very quickly that they were absolutely right, and this is the way to do it. So although it's history, there is there's a considerable personal element with it, and I kind of let myself be taken along in each chapter by what fascinates me. And that took me down all kinds of interesting rabbit holes. One of them is the most difficult of all to get to, which there would have been no chance of diving on as an individual diver, and that's the Gersopper, which was a Second World War freighter, British merchantman, sunk off in the North Atlantic by U-boat, which was carrying an enormous cargo of up to 200 tons of silver. And this was discovered in 2011, and a large part of it was excavated. And it's very haunting for me because my grandfather was a merchant Navy captain during the war, and he used to talk to me a lot about it. And so seeing the images that were taken by remote operated vehicles of this wreck of the Gersopper lying at almost 4,700 meters deep in the just pitch darkness of the abyss, lying there, sitting there intact, and all but one of the men on her died, was incredibly haunting. And I think to go down on and see that, as to see, for example, the Titanic, would be an extraordinary experience. But it's so deep that it can't be done, by conventional diving. So that was fantastic. The other one, which is one of the most beguiling wrecks ever, is a site that I visited but didn't dive on. And this is the Uluba and Bronze Age wreck, which was discovered in the early 1980s and excavated by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. And that is a site that I often describe as being comparable to King Tut's tomb. It's so important. It was a ship carrying this incredible cargo of the value of a typical kingdom of the period. It had about 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin on it, the ingredients of bronze, which was enough to equip an entire army of the period, and gold and all sorts of other materials. So it was very, very lavish, rich cargo, and excavated in incredible detail, incredible scientific detail over a period of 10 years. And I think anybody working on that site was very, very lucky. It was an extraordinary wreck to excavate, and it's still being studied extensively because so many artifacts were discovered from it, and they're still being, characterized and analyzed. The one experience I do write about in this book is on a wreck off this part of Cornwall where I've been living. And in fact, I'm going there next week again to do possibly the same thing. So this is very immediate for me. But this is a wreck of an English warship called the Royal Anne Galley, and she wrecked in 1721 while taking the new governor of Barbados out from England to the Caribbean, and she was blown back by one of the huge gales you get in that part of the Atlantic against this sort of forbidding rocky shore. And the place where she's wrecked is right off the end of the very southernmost point of England, and it's in one of these terrible tidal streams. So half the time you've got the tide rushing in one way, and half the time the other way, and that there are these jagged rocks sticking out of the sea at this point, where at least 50 ships have been wrecked over the years that we know about, and the Royal Anne Galley was one of these. And so it's not a deep wreck, but it's right in the midst of these kind of dragon's teeth sticking out of the sea, with the sea churning round. And getting out to that site from the shore, the first time I did that was a real challenge, because I didn't know what to expect. I knew, roughly speaking, what the sea was doing and what the tides were doing, and every meter that I finned along, I kept wondering, what am I doing? As I got closer and closer to these rocks sticking out and could feel the tide tugging me. So that sort of thing, that's been more my experience than anything to do with sharks and predators. But there's nothing more dangerous and powerful than the sea itself, and you just have to respect it hugely and know what you're doing, really. So the first thing that happens when you get in the water, for me at any rate, is this tremendous sense of almost euphoria. It's calm. It calms you down because you've been carrying all this gear, and it's all very heavy and awkward. And you get in the sea, and it's just tremendously relaxing and calming. But then very quickly that's overtaken by that heightened awareness you have to have doing anything, where climbing a mountain is the same, where you know that everything depends on your gear and your buddies and your state of mind, and being absolutely clued into what you're doing. And that stays with you through the dive. You can't relax from that. And that just sort of gives everything a heightened awareness. It's like everything is put into closer pixelation. It's more focused all the time, and you're sort of under pressure of time. So you've only got a short time on these dives. And so the things that you're seeing, you're trying to absorb as much as possible. And the huge excitement is when you're hunting for a wreck. And often the wrecks, particularly where I've been diving recently, are not easy to see because they might be sort of scattered and covered in kelp and things. And when you get down right to the seabed and part the fronds and look down the gully, and there's a cannon sticking out, it's the most exciting feeling. So a tremendous rush of discovery. And that's probably a bit addictive as well. I think, once you've found something like that, you want to find more and keep doing it. It's because it's just such a great experience. I was working hard on this book for 18 months, I would say, and working very hard on it for maybe about 8 months. And it came out in a very intensive rush. I mean, I found that once I got my wheels turning with it, and worked out how to do it, it was just a very solid, continuous process. One of the issues with writing nonfiction compared to fiction is this thing called facts, and you have to make sure you've got it as right as you can, and that's a huge challenge. I mean, the production of a book like this is a much, much bigger deal than the production of a novel, because you're having so much fact checking to do. You can never get something 100% right, but you try your best. What I've always found with writing is that I'll do a lot of note taking, lots of it. I'll spend, even with the fiction, I'd spend several months just reading and thinking and taking notes and stuff. When I actually sit down to write, I push all that aside. And I was doing that with this book as well, so that I had in my head what I needed to write each chapter mostly. But I find that if you've got too much fact sitting on bits of note paper all around you, it tends to reduce the quality. It swamps the book, doesn't it? I mean, you end up no longer writing a strong narrative, but you write a narrative where you're constantly concerned, have I got this, that, or the other into it? And so that's probably been my my revelation as to technique with the nonfiction. You then return to it and have this huge job of working through it bit by bit to make sure everything is actually as you remembered it and checking it. But I think for the actual writing, for me anyway, it would have been a mistake to sit there and have all this stuff to cherry pick to try to squeeze into it, because it would have reduced it as a piece of literature. Have been delighted with how well the Shipwrecks book has done and the reviews it's had. And that's hugely encouraged me to look ahead to doing more nonfiction. And just as with the fiction, I can see ahead multiple books as to what I do.